Tarrant County Master Gardener Association has partnered with the Tarrant Regional Water District to encourage water conservation. TRWD maintains 4 area lakes and pipelines needed to provide surface water to local water treatment plants so they can clean that water to meet drinking standards for our communities. There are currently 2.3 million people living in Tarrant County, and this is expected to double over the next 50 years. At SaveTarrantWater.com, you can sign up for free weekly watering advice custom to your location. There's also an event calendar where you can find information about future classes and workshops. So be sure and check out SaveTarrantWater.com to sign up for their free services.
Can everyone hear me? And can everyone see the screen? So let me know now if you can't, or because I'm going to get going. I'll let everybody know I'm just coming off of a summer cold, so I hope that my nasally voice is not a distraction, and hopefully I can make it through this without a coughing fit. But anyway, if you'll just bear with me, we will get through this, and I hope you learn a lot and are encouraged. So yes, tonight we're going to be speaking on low maintenance landscape design. I'm just going to give you some tips to get started and go over the principles of landscape design. And then this is part 1 of a 3-part series. Next week, we're going to be doing perennials and annuals. And the week after that, we're going to be doing trees, shrubs, and vines. So I hope you will join us for the next program. So yep, today is landscape design. So I love this quote by Gertrude Jekyll. She's a landscape designer back, in England back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And basically what she's saying here is you can have a lot of plants, but it takes careful selection and definite intention to arrange them in a way that forms a beautiful picture. In her last quote there, it is in the way that it's done that lies the whole difference between commonplace gardening and gardening that may rightly claim to rank as fine art. So that's what I do when I'm designing. I'm trying to create a beautiful picture with plants. So I hope that you can get some tips to do the same in your garden. So if this is your idea of a beautiful garden, but you think that this is all that we can do in Texas is grow some rocks, I want to challenge you with that and show you this picture. This was a program that I created for my garden club several years ago, and each one of these rectangles represents a month in your garden. And all of these pictures were taken by me either in my garden or at a botanical garden in the North Texas area. So this represents color that we can have throughout the year in our gardens. And it doesn't mean necessarily blooms. It could come from foliage or from berries, but just to create color in your garden. So to get started on some principles of landscape design, we're going to go through each one of these separately, but I'll just kind of whip through the list here. Scale, balance, dominance or focal point, unity, repetition or rhythm, simplicity. And another way an acronym to maybe help you remember these principles, it's the acronym BIRDS. Balance, interconnectivity or unity, repetition, dominance, and scale. So scale is the proportion between 2 sets of dimensions. Basically, if you have a big house, you're going to want bigger beds. If you have a smaller house, you're going to make the size of those beds a little bit smaller, just as an example. Here in this large garden in Fort Worth, they used huge flagstone. I mean, each one of these flagstones is about the size of half of a vehicle. And in contrast to that, this small garden on that same tour that I went to in Fort Worth used these little pavers that are about 1 foot wide by maybe 8 inches deep. And, so if you were to use that small of a paver in that large garden, you can see how that would be so out of scale and vice versa. So balance refers to the visual weight of plant material from one side of the landscape to the other. There's symmetrical balance, which is more formal. There's asymmetrical balance, which is more informal. So what you want to do is take a line, visually draw a line down the middle of the space that you're trying to landscape. And then just, if you were to put each of those sides on a scale, trying to get them to weigh basically the same. So here's an example of symmetrical balance. this is, if you were to take a line and draw it down the front door, you would see that each side of the house and each side, the landscaping is exactly the same. It's usually very formal landscaping. This is an example of asymmetrical balance. If you can look on the right side of the picture, you can see right here that the house is a little bit wider on this side than it is on the other side. So to balance that, we extended the bed beyond the house and added a little ornamental tree and some shrubs over there to just give some weight to that side of the landscape. So I hope that makes sense. Dominance or focal point, it's just what you want your eye to go to. And that could be a plant, it could be statuary, a fountain. So here in this example, this is at my church garden in South Lake. I oversee the landscape maintenance at my church garden, and this fountain is in the center of that courtyard. It's what your eye goes to. Unity is, harmony is another way of saying that. It's just your landscape working together as a whole. Continuity, interconnectivity was the other word that we used before. So maybe this is not an example of what I mean by flowing together, but this is an example of disunity. You would never plant the plants in the upper left picture in the same bed that you would plant, use a hydrangea. One set of plants needs full sun and dry conditions, whereas the hydrangea needs shade and more moist conditions. So you want to make sure that your plant material is all working together. This is my front yard. It's just showing an example of perennials flowing, across the sidewalk from one to the other, and use of perennials throughout the whole area to unify that area. Repetition or rhythm, I always tell people the easiest principle to incorporate is repetition. Find something that works in your garden and just do more of it. And that can be plant material or textures or colors, hardscape. One little tip is when you're adding plant material, group in odd numbers, 3s, 5s, 7. Once you get beyond 9, 11, once you start getting that high, nobody's counting to, that you've got an even number, that you've got 10 plants as opposed to, 9 or 11. But anyway, just a general rule of thumb. So here's, repetition here where they've used the formal landscaping in that area. And then this is repetition using color. I've, used this limey green and the burgundy in lots of different plant material, but it's repeated throughout my garden in different ways. So that's one example of repetition. And simplicity is the last. It's just less is more to avoid a very cluttered look. This is maybe a little too simple, maybe not quite what we mean by a simple landscape. But this here is just simple beauty. This was taken when I was up in the Cape Cod area. I just thought that was beautiful. I mean, all this landscape needs is, that beautiful little bench out there just sitting amongst nature. So you don't have to add a lot to make that area beautiful. This here picture was taken up at P. Allen Smith's garden up in Arkansas. It's just a beautiful area that, they've just added some Adirondack chairs up there to enjoy the nature. So sometimes you don't need to add much. So let's review our principles. So, what do you think here? We've got scale. I would say we don't really hit the point on scale. Dominance or focal point, maybe. We've got 2 focal points there. Rhythm, maybe. Unity, repetition. Yeah, we are repeating elements, and it is very simple. But just because you're hitting maybe some of the principles, it doesn't really rank as fine art or that beautiful picture or painting with landscape that we're trying to create. So Now going on to elements of design. Again, I'll show you examples of all of these, but just to go through the list, we're starting with line. There are straight lines with landscape that do tend to be more formal, and then there are sweeping curves that tend to give you a more informal look. And then there's all different types of plant forms. I'll show you a picture of this in a minute. And then color, whether it's warm color or cool color, whether you're going to be viewing this from a distance or whether you have the color up close to you, so you don't have to have it quite as intense. And then texture, contrasting textures. So contrasting coarse and smooth and broad and fine makes your plant, each plant stand out better than if all the textures are the same. So line, starting with line, I am all about easy mowing because you have to mow your lawn every week. So make that the easiest thing that you have to do. So I don't think that this is easy mowing. This line is very wavy and there's a point created in there where you cannot get your mower in there. You have to take a weed eater to get in there and the grass is not growing because of that. This is another example of what not to do. I'm sure they spent a lot of money on that concrete edging, and I would be dizzy if I had to mow that every week. So that's not what I'm talking about. I had a landscape architect tell me one time, think about the edges of your line looking more like the back of a dolphin than the back of a camel. So I strive for long sweeping lines instead of really wavy. So this is an example of those long sweeping lines that are much more pleasing to the eye and much easier to mow. This is in my backyard, just long sweeping lines that, are very easy to mow. So what I do when I start a design, I am concerned about the shape of the lawn. I let the beds form themselves based on what the shape of the lawn is. So what I do is I take a hose or a cord. I carry around a 100-foot orange electrical cord in my truck, and that's what I use to lay out the line. It's very easy to see. And then when I spray my orange marking paint, I don't have to worry about spraying on the orange cord. But what I do is I lay it out and I get the feel of the lawn, and then I kind of just tweak it and I see where those lines are maybe too sharp, that it's going to be too hard to get the mower to make that curve. So you can just adjust it and tweak it. And the beds, whatever is left over become the beds. I hope that makes sense. I start with the lawn. So here, this is just showing how a concave bed line going toward the house pulls your eye toward that front door. It just makes it more inviting. And this is the examples of different plant forms that I was talking about. I always joke and say, notice there are no square shrubs in this picture. I always said God did not create square shrubs. And I'm joking because if you like formal landscaping, that you're probably going to have a lot of square shrubs. But this is low maintenance landscape class, and square hedging takes a lot more maintenance to maintain. So just think about that. I just liked to allow shrubs to take on their natural form. Yes, I do size control them by pruning, but then I allow them to grow back into their natural form. Colors. Opposites always attract, so you're always going to have a beautiful picture when you put opposite colors together. So if you look on the color wheel, you've got the yellow on the top and the purple on the bottom. Those are opposites and they always look good together, but you can also use complementary colors together. And really, you know what? There's no rules with color. If you like it, use it, This is a phrase that was coined by maybe Jimmy Turner, who used to be at the Dallas Arboretum. He called it 65-mile-an-hour color. So when you're driving by on the road at 65 miles an hour, you want your landscape to stand out, you want some bright color out there. This is at my church garden. And one time I used a really pale annual color by the entryway sign, and it just did not stand out. It was definitely not 65-mile-an-hour color. This is, I guess, 35-mile-an-hour color at a subdivision in South Lake. So when you're driving by, those pansies in the wintertime just really popped because they're very intense color. So think about, if you're wanting to have some more subtle color, maybe you would use that on your patio where you're going to be in a seating area and you can enjoy those more subtle colors up close. Here's what I was talking about with contrasting texture. You can see the fine texture of the Japanese maple and the broad texture of the leopard plant. This leopard plant is what I use instead of hostas. It does so great here in North Texas. This grows, this is a little seedling that just grows in my yard. It reseeds everywhere. So I love it. Anyway, just to point out that when you contrast the textures, they play off of each other better than if they were both fine or both broad. So this is an inventory. I want to go through each of these items. So when you are thinking about landscaping your area, I want you to, maybe you can take a screenshot of this. This program is being recorded too, so maybe you can go back and review it. But if you want to take a screenshot, and just these are all of the areas that you need to go through and think about when you are planning a garden. So, do you need trees or shrubs? Of course, everybody needed shrubs after this February's freeze, but do you want to add annual color, or do you want your color to come from perennials? Do you want a veggie garden? How much lawn do you want, or none at all? What are the existing plants that you have to work with? And then think about that style. Do you want a more formal style or informal? And then hardscape. What do you need for hardscape? We've all got a driveway and we usually have a patio attached to the house. But do you want to expand that patio? Do you need to add some walkways? Do you need retaining walls on a slope? Do you want to add an outdoor entertaining area, a fire pit, things like that? So think through that. And then function and aesthetics. Your landscape can look really good, but if it doesn't function for you, if you've created this beautiful bed that has now created a block to get from point A to point B, it doesn't matter how pretty it is, it's going to annoy you every time you have to walk around it. So it has to function for you as well. Water features, do you want it to be a full-blown pond with fish or just something like a little bird bath? Sun and shade conditions, this is a huge thing to consider. I always recommend to my clients to create a sun chart or a sun list. I tell them to take a piece of paper and write 7 a.m., 8, 9, 10, all the way down to 7 p.m. Just make a list. And over the course of maybe a week, look, maybe one day you're going to be home before you go to work between 7 and 8, and you can jot down whether that area that you're wanting to landscape is sun or shade. Maybe you happen to come home for lunch and you're there, between, 12 and 2 or something like that, and you jot that down. And then when you get home from work, you've got a couple hours left, you can jot that timing down. And then maybe you're home all day on Saturday and you can fill in the rest of the slots. But usually over a week or two, you can get every single time slot filled in. And then, that area that you thought was full sun, you might realize, oh my goodness, that's only getting sun between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. So that makes a huge difference on sun plants, like perennials that need 6 hours of full sun to perform well. They would not perform well in 2 hours of evening sun. And also you need to realize that afternoon sun in Texas is brutal compared to 2 hours of morning sun, which is much more gentle. So that determines the plant material that you can use. Irrigation, determine whether you want to use overhead sprinklers or whether you want drip irrigation. Then you've got to consider whether you've got any drainage or erosion issues and whether you need to add, underground drains or use above ground creek beds, things like that. And, over the last month or in May, when we got so much rain, if you didn't have a drainage or an erosion issue brought to light, then you probably don't have one, but they may have brought those issues to light for you. So you can address those. Service area or storage needs. We're gardeners. We all have stuff. We all have tools, equipment. We've got, soil, potting soil. So, do you want to add a greenhouse? Do you need a storage shed for those things so you can get them out of the garage and quit aggravating your significant other that wants more room in the garage? Not that I would know anything about that. Um, Views, borrowed landscape. When you have your neighbor's property, do they have something that you like to see that you want to capitalize on? Or do they have an eyesore that you need to screen? So think about that. And then the next one is privacy or screening or fencing. Do you need to add some fencing in an area? Do you need to add some plants to do some screening? And what those plants would be. And then think about your plant dislikes and even color likes or dislikes. I had a client one time that everything had to be pink. And I had another client one time that nothing could be orange. So I had to tailor the plant material to those likes and dislikes. Maintenance. The number one request that I get from clients is that they want their landscape to be low. And that has a different meaning to different people. I have clients that would spend 8 hours a day every day in their garden because they love it. And I have clients that don't want to spend 15 minutes a month in their garden. That's how low they want it to be. But low does not mean no. There is some maintenance that will be needed. The next line down there, children or pets, do you need a big expansive lawn for your kids to play a game of football, or, a place for your pets to go do their business? So just think about those things. And then wildlife, do you want to attract wildlife? Or, sometimes we attract wildlife that we don't want to. I always have trouble with armadillos digging holes and raccoons and things like that. But, we all love to attract the butterflies and the bees. So think about those things. And then hardiness zone. I'll talk more about this, but we are in that 7B, 8A. And of course, this winter, we actually had a zone 6 winter, which I understand was rare, but we do kind of need to take that into consideration for plant choices. And then if you have a plot plan of your house that shows your property lines and just the lay of the land, that does tend to be really helpful when you're doing an overall plan. Okay, just kind of some nuts and bolts of how to do it. I like to use this graph paper that has, is it 4 squares per inch? So they're larger squares, and what I do is I count every square as 1 foot. It just makes it easier to count. And this is the old way of doing it, the easy way to do it. You don't need any technical computer skills to do this. It's just a piece of graph paper and a pencil and probably an eraser, and then a tape measure, because you're going to be measuring out the front of your house and taking into consideration where your windows are. You're measuring along a fence. In this particular picture here, I'm measuring along a wrought iron fence at the back, and we were building the beds out from that. And then when you plan your plant material in, if you look at the mature size and it says that it's a 6 foot wide and tall shrub, you're going to count 6 squares to allow 6 feet for that plant to grow. And this is a final design, and you can get as fancy as you want, but this is not necessary for your average homeowner who just wants to draw out a scribbled little plan for your backyard. And then there's also computer programs. A friend of mine who is another landscape designer, she uses Pro Landscape Design software. It's a CAD program, and so you can get as technical with this as you want. I know nothing about doing a computer drawing, so I just do scribbles on graph paper. It's easy. So if you hear nothing else that you hear tonight, hear right plant, right place. We always want to plant the right plant in the right place. And some of the things that we need to consider are the cultural requirements of the plant material. Does it need sun? Does it need shade? And after you've done that sun chart, you're going to know what you have in your garden, and you can choose the plants that fit that. Do the plants that you want to use, are they xeric plants that need almost no water, or is it a hydrangea that's going to need a little more water? Get a soil test. Check the soil pH. Do you have acidic soil? Do you have alkaline soil? In Tarrant County, we tend to have more more alkaline soil, pardon me, as opposed to like Tyler, Texas, that tends to be more acidic. And the farther west that we go, the higher alkalinity. And then know the hardiness zone. I always mention this. Look for plants in that, what I call the sweet spot of zone 6 to 9, because that way you get some cold tolerance on the cold side, the hardiness side, and then you get some heat tolerance, with a zone 9. And then your windows. Most of the windows that we have on our homes are about 1.5 to 2 feet off the ground. So you're going to choose a plant that will stay lower growing, because you don't want to plant, for instance, a Nellie R. Stevens holly that's going to grow 15 feet tall and expect to keep it under 2 feet tall. And I will show you an example later on in the program where someone tried to do that. And you're asking too much of that plant and yourself. That's a lot of maintenance when there are lots of plants that can fit that low growing requirement, which leads us into the next category there, pruning and maintenance. How much do you want to prune? If you will put the right plant in the right place, it's going to keep your maintenance and your pruning to an absolute minimum. And so then know your plant characteristics and absolutely know the mature sizes. We all have a cell phone. So when you go to the nursery and something catches your eye, Google it right away. Just, look at the plant, look how big it gets. Don't just trust the tag. Read the tag, but then do some Googling and maybe talk to some real Texas gardeners, because, in Texas, if it says a plant is going to get 3 to 4 feet tall, trust me, it'll be 4 feet. So everything is bigger in Texas, right? All right. Don't try this in Texas. This was taken in Cape Cod, and this is a Japanese maple growing in full blasting sun, surrounded by hot reflective concrete. It would last a nanosecond in our summers. It's growing in the same bed right there as a rose. So if you were to try to put a Japanese maple and a rose in the same bed in Texas, one of them is not going to be happy. So this is the right plant, but it's in the wrong place. This is a Yopon holly tree form. It's a native, it's an excellent, excellent plant. But one, it's blocking the window that's behind it. They're having to prune it a lot to keep it from growing into the gutters. And then they're also having to prune so that they can see that sign. It would have made a whole lot more sense to me if they had used a small shrub in that spot than to use a shrub that grows 15 feet tall and wide and having to do so much maintenance to keep it in bounds. I like to show this picture. This is a Yopon holly as well in mushroom form. You can't see out of the windows. You can't grow anything below it. It's a lot of maintenance. It's dangerous maintenance because you're having to get up on a ladder. And so I would propose to let it grow out naturally. It will take about 3 years. Start pruning it up from the bottom, removing the lower limbs, exposing the bottom trunks, and then letting the top grow out naturally. And now it's no pruning, and you can see out the windows, and you can plant something below it. So this is just an example of allowing a plant to grow into its natural form as opposed to high maintenance pruning. So here, these are some windows that are only about 2 feet, the bottom of the window is only about 2 feet off the ground, but here we have some large shrubs that are growing, well over halfway above the window. These are Burford hollies and an abelia. Both of those are excellent shrubs, but they just grow too big for that space. So they are the right plant again in the wrong place. So here we've replaced those with little Yopon hollies that, now this is the little shrub form as opposed to the tree form I just showed you, but these are easily kept at about 2.5 feet tall and 3 feet wide. I have them in my garden and they've been there for 23 years, and I prune them once a year and keep them that small. Speaking of windows, go inside your house and look from the inside out. This was at a particular client in Arlington, and she's the one picture is in her bedroom window looking out across a patio, and she wanted to look out in the morning and see something pretty out there. And the other windows are her dining room. So they wanted a pretty picture to look out their dining room as well. So we added a fountain there and then some perennials. So go inside and look out. Again, do you have that eyesore that when you look out your window, you see the eyesore at your neighbors and you need to screen that. Another, this is called the rule of thirds. It's just in design, whether it's in your house or even with photographs, that sweet spot is the 1/3, the 1/3 vertically and horizontally. You can see where the tree is in that picture. That is the most pleasing spot in that picture. And in the landscape picture, in that bed, in that island bed there, the tree is planted in like the 1/3 spot, and the little bird bath or fountain is in the other 1/3 spot. If one of those items had been placed smack dab in the middle of that bed, it just would not be as pleasing to the eye. Trees, have mercy on Encore Electric, because their job is to keep your electricity on. So be sure that you put the right plant in the right place. You're not going to want to plant a large shade tree right underneath the lines, because they're going to come and do the pruning for you, and it won't be pretty, but they do have a job to do, which is keeping your electricity on. So as I just mentioned, you don't want to plant a tall shade tree underneath the electric lines. And if you look at this shoe-marred red oak, look at that asterisk there. This plant grows 70 to 80 feet tall. So not a plant that you would want to put in that spot. It's an excellent shade tree, so use it where it can grow large, just not underneath the electric lines. You're going to want to choose a smaller, more ornamental tree for that spot. So plant hardiness zones, Texas, I'm not sure any other state in the nation can say this, but we cover 5 hardiness zones in the state of Texas. So right here, this shows the Dallas-Fort Worth area right there. And we are in that zone 8. This winter, we did approach zone 6. Well, actually, we were in zone 6. So we used to laugh about this when, we would hear that it was going to be in the 20s and the 30s, that we were Texans. We just couldn't handle that cold. But boy, we got hit this February, didn't we? It reached those zone 6 temperatures. In my area, it was -2. And I've never seen that in the 30 plus years that I've lived here. I grew up in Wisconsin, so I've seen much colder than that, but not down here. So our plants really took a hit. And, Texas is the land of extremes. So on the flip side of that, this was back in 2011. If any of you remember that year, that's the year that we had 70 or 71 days over 100 degrees and no rain. So, you've got to choose some plants that can handle both of those extremes. And that's why I always recommend choosing plants that are in that zone 6 to 9. So you get a cushion on each end. So here, if you look at this plant tag, you're going to see that this Rosalita cleome, if you look at the zone there, it says that it's hardy in zones 10 to 11. So that would tell you right there that this plant will not survive our winter of zone 8. It's going to die. So it's treated as an annual here. Whereas maybe down in Houston, it might survive a winter. Here's Kaleidoscopilia. If you look at the zone information there, it says it's hardy to zone 6 to 10, and it's hardy to 10 below. Now, I have to admit that the abelias did take a hit this winter, which really surprised me, since they are hardy to 10 below, but they are recovering now. If they were just pruned back hard, they are recovering now and should be fine. But and hopefully we're not going to see another winter like that for a long, long time. And then here, if you look at this vine, it hits that zone 6 to 9, so it's great, a vine for our area. One thing I do want to caution you on is please watch the height of it. It can grow up to 25 feet tall, so you don't want to put this on a little 3-foot trellis. So take that into consideration too. Clematis might be a better vine for a smaller trellis. So when you buy your little 3-gallon shrub at the nursery, it's this tiny little thing. And if you look behind it, that's the mature size of some Indian hawthorns at that point that were about 8 to 10 years old. So be sure to consider that mature size on your plant material. And now I don't even recommend Indian hawthorns anymore. This is an old picture. One, they are susceptible to Entomosporium fungal leaf spot. and any leaves that are left over, the bagworms chew off, and anything that was left over from that, the freeze got this year. So, I call that the trifecta of done. I'm just done with that plant. So if you want to use it again, that's fine. Just know going in that it has some issues. All right. I do want to talk about this plant spacing. This is based on mature growth, and you'll, maybe if you have a landscape plan done for you, they're going to talk about planting on center. So if you have a 6-foot shrub, that you're planting next to another 6-foot shrub, you're going to be planting them 6 to 7 feet on center. So one plant to the next plant is going to be 6 to 7 feet away, even though when you buy them, they're little bitty, 1 foot wide plants. You still need to plant them 6 foot on center. So you take the center of the plant to the center of the plant, and that's how you do your measurement. Like for instance, a Gulf Stream or an Obsession Nandina, I plant those 30 inches on center. Center of the plant to the center of the next plant is 30 inches. When you first plant them, yep, there's going to be some space in between them. You've got to be okay with that, but they will grow into that space, and then they will be spaced properly from here on out. So if you are into strictly native plants, I would just encourage you to go to the Native Plant Society of Texas website right there, npsot.org. But I prefer to use native and adapted plants. One, because they are adapted to this area, and if they're native, of course, they work in this area because they have, they tend to be more drought tolerant, more heat tolerant, more efficient with water, and they tend to have lower fertilizer and pesticide requirements. So, but my main reason for using native and adapted plants are because they just work. So, well, you want to use plants that work in Texas because it's hard here. It's hard. Soil. Most of us in this area have clay soil that tends to be more on the alkaline side. And then some of us in that cross timbers ribbon that runs through Tarrant County, you'll have that sandier soil that is a little more on the acid side, maybe not as acidic as Tyler, Texas, but it tends to be a little more acidic. So you can choose plant material like azaleas and gardenias that might do better for you than people like me who have a pH of 7.6 and 8.1. But don't guess on your soil pH. Go to soiltesting.tamu.edu and get the information to send in a soil sample, and that way you'll know exactly what your pH is and what plants you can tailor to that soil. This is just showing the different soil formations in the state of Texas, and right here in north central Texas, we're in that East Cross Timbers, the Grand Prairie, and the Blackland Prairie soils, which again tend to be more alkaline, but in that cross timbers, eastern cross timbers, it is a little more on the acid side. Regardless of what kind of soil you have, the best thing you can do when you're prepping a bed is add compost. It improves your soil texture. It will add nutrients. Put it down at least 3 inches. I have the calculation coming up here in a minute to show you how to measure and determine how much you need. But the saying is plant a 50-cent plant in a $5 hole. And all that means is spend your money on the bed prep, because if you prep your area well, your plants have a much greater chance of success. If you do have heavy clay soil, we recommend adding expanded shale to the planting area. And this is not a top dressing. This is something that is mixed in down into 6 inches of your soil. It's expanded shale is shale rock that's been superheated, and it breaks it into these little pebbles or gravel like. And so it's this lightweight aggregate that does improve drainage in clay soils when it's mixed in. You can buy that by a 40-pound bag, and most independent garden centers will carry this. Know before you dig. So before you start digging, call 811 and give them a couple days notice, and they'll come out and mark all the utility lines in the area that you want to landscape, so that you don't have to worry about whether you're going to be digging into an electrical or a gas line or a cable line. So be sure to call. And then mulch. Mulch is a non-negotiable when you finish your landscape. You've done all this prep. Now you've got to add mulch as that final step. It conserves moisture. It suppresses weeds. You know, you're still going to have to do a little bit of weed control, but it will help you. And if you will put down at least 3 inches of mulch, it will really help with that. It moderates soil temperatures. So, you know, here summer is upon us, and moderating soil temperature will be very helpful for keeping your plants happy. And lastly, it just looks good. It just tidies everything up and makes everything look good. Speaking of mulch, we don't want to mulch up around the trunks of our trees. We call these mulch volcanoes. These are some pine trees over in South Lake, and they have mulched up so heavily on the trunk of that tree. It looks like a telephone pole with a pile of dirt around it. If the trunk of your tree is going into the soil so straight, one, it's planted too deeply, and then you just don't want to mulch up around it. You want to see the flare of the trunk of your tree. This right here is a thing of beauty. Now, the problem is that this tree is so happy that turf will not grow underneath of it, but don't let that stop you. I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute here on what you can plant in those areas that will love the shade and do great underneath those trees. But we want to see the flares of those trunks. Don't cover them up with a bunch of mulch. So here is what I was talking about before and how to do some measurements. You can take a screenshot of this or watch this again. But when you're measuring for compost and mulch, you measure your square footage, which is just the length times the width of the area. Then you calculate the depth in inches, and I'm usually recommending 3 inches of compost or 3 inches of mulch, and then you multiply that point by 0.0031, and that will give you cubic yardage. So if you are ordering compost or mulch from a bulk compost facility, you know, they will bring it in a dump truck, and usually there's a minimum of 4 yards that you have to order. But, you know, round up instead of, you know, you're not going to get 9.3 cubic yards, but, you know, get 10, and then they will deliver it for a fee. And that's if you're doing a very large area. If you need to do it by the bag, take that number and multiply it by 13.5, and that will tell you how many 2-foot cubic bags that you need. So most compost and mulch is sold in 2 cubic foot bags. Every once in a while you can find 3 cubic foot bags, but that's rare. So that'll give you that calculation to know how many bags that you need if you have a smaller area and don't need the yardage. And then on cobblestone, like if you're doing a creek bed, again, you measure the square footage, and if you divide that by 65, that will tell you how many tons or yards of cobblestone that you need. And when you're doing a creek bed, I'll show you some examples later. Make sure you use 2 to 4 or 3 to 5 inch cobblestone. Don't use little tiny 1 inch river rock or pea gravel, because when the water comes screaming through an area, it's going to move that rock. And if you use bigger rock, it'll stay put and the water can flow over it without moving those rocks. And then ground cover. Here's just a calculation that I have found that works for me, is if you will measure the square footage of the area that you're wanting to plant ground cover, multiply that by 2.5, because you're planting 2.5 plants per foot, and then you divide that by 18, because there are 18 plants in a flat. That will tell you the number of flats that you need to cover a ground cover area. So I hope that helps. So maintenance, something to consider, water requirements. That's why we like to use native and adapted plants. How much are you going to water? And be sure you follow your city water restrictions, which is usually watering no more than twice a day between the hours of 6 p.m. up to 10 a.m. And I usually don't recommend watering in the dark of night because that creates fungal problems. So try to water early morning. And then what is your irrigation going to be, whether it's drip or it's spray? And then fertilizing, I recommend fertilizing in April, June, and September for your lawn and your beds. I use the same kind of fertilizer for everything. I usually use an organic granular, and I apply it on my lawn with a broadcaster and I fling it into the beds with I just grab a handful and fling it in. I grab and fling, grab and fling. There's no measuring with organics. You don't want to put it down too heavily, but just a general scattering of it will be fine. If you're using synthetics, please follow the directions on the bag. Weed control, whether you're using your fingers to do the weed control or a hoe or herbicides, you can decide on that. Mowing, we need to mow every week. You want to mow no more than 1/3 of the height of the grass every week. So, and St. Augustine gets mowed at 2.5 to 3 inches tall, and Bermuda is usually mowed at about 1.5 inches tall. So Bermuda gets mowed much lower than St. Augustine. And then zoysia is somewhere right in the middle of that. Pruning, determine, there are certain times to do pruning. I'll talk about that in a minute. There's 3 main times to do pruning. And then budget, consider your budget. Is the sky the limit, or are you doing this on a shoestring and you want all your plants to be freebies from your friends? So, and that's a possibility. So I do want to talk about water conservation here. This is at a shopping center over in South Lake, and this is drip irrigation running on a weekend. And I would see this every single weekend. So that's not conserving water. Drip irrigation is not, no irrigation system is a once and done. It needs to be monitored. So be sure that you audit your sprinkler system, whether it's spray or drip, to find out whether you have some leaking issues, as this apparently is. With drip irrigation, you want to keep it covered with mulch. The intense sunlight on it can erode it. You can see right here that the staples that were used to hold down that drip irrigation are actually crimping it to the point that there's no water getting through that. So be sure to monitor this. And then when you did your pruning in the winter time and cut your perennials back, did you accidentally cut through your drip line so that now this spring when it starts running, it's going to be a gusher? And I don't mean to just pick on drip irrigation, because you need to watch your spray heads as well. Check them the beginning of every season, to make sure that everything's still functioning. Did you have did the freeze crack one of your heads? Do you need to replace just a nozzle? Do you have a break in a pipe underground? So you just need to monitor those things and run the system, run through every head and just take a look at it. And then also, don't just leave it on auto. Make sure if we've had all this rain this spring, I haven't had my system on, pretty much all year. So we may be getting into the season now that it's pushing triple digits and the rain has stopped, that we will need to be supplementing again. But anyway, pruning, there are 3 main times. The first time of the year is usually mid-February. I understand this year we had a challenging situation, but usually mid-February is the first time to do heavy pruning of most shrubs, perennials, and ornamental grasses. And it's that 3 to 4 weeks before our average last freeze. Our average last freeze is mid-March, so we back that up 3 to 4 weeks. That takes us into mid-February, and that's when you start doing most of your pruning. The next time to prune would be any spring blooming shrubs immediately after their spring blooms have faded, that you would want to prune those. And that would be like an Indian hawthorn or a bridal wreath spirea, something like that. If you need to size control them, that's when you would do that. Ideally, though, if you've planted the right plant in the right place, you won't need to do that pruning. And then the last time would be in mid-November, which is when we usually get our first freeze in the fall. And a lot of perennials will suffer freeze burn. The tops will die back, and then you can go ahead and cut those down to the ground. But you don't have to. I like to leave any perennials that maybe have some wildlife benefit. Maybe for the birds, there's some seed heads, or it's creating some cover for the birds in the wintertime. So you don't have to cut them down right then, but if you like to keep a neat and tidy garden, you can do that right after that first freeze in the fall. So if this is your first time pruning, I do have a pruning program, and I also have a pruning newsletter. So if you want to check out my blog site for that, you can learn some more on that. We'll just go over some really general things right now. I just want to talk about pruning a tree. You can see that big ouch right there. That's because it was done improperly and it's created this huge wound down the side. The correct way to do the pruning of a large branch on a tree, and please, if the branch is too high and too large, please call a certified arborist to help you with this. But if it's small enough that you can reach it safely, the first cut that you make is an undercut that's done, 6 inches to a foot away from the trunk. And you will, halfway cut that undercut. Then you go out beyond that, a few inches and cut the whole branch off. And that gets that weight off of the branch so that you don't have that injury I just showed you. And then you make your final cut that is right up close to the branch collar. On red oak and live oak, we do want to caution you to only prune in the hottest part of summer, July or August, and then the even better time would be in the middle of winter before February 15th. So if you do stake your trees, and I usually don't recommend that, but if you're in a high wind situation and you need to stake your trees, be sure to remove that staking material within a year because it can embed into the trunk of your tree, particular tree, to end up dying from that injury. Be sure to remove girdling roots that have grown around the bottom of your trunk. Be sure to cut those off. Just take a lopper and cut that root off. Don't let it girdle the trunk. One of my little pet peeves on edging is that the edging has not been installed into the ground. In this picture, you can see that the edging is basically sitting on top of the ground, which is just an invitation for Bermuda to invade that bed, and that's exactly what it's done. You can see right there, it's grown into the bed, and now you've got a problem. So when you install edging, usually it's 4 inches, wide. You want to dig a trench 3 inches deep and set the edging down in that trench, and you only want 1 inch sticking above the ground. That will help prevent that Bermuda from growing underneath. You can always weed eat the top every week to keep it from growing over the top, but you want something to help you to keep it from growing underneath. Another little pet peeve is putting edging in next to concrete. To me, the concrete is the edging, and that metal edging just creates that skinny little space between the edging and the concrete that is a place for weeds that no tool fits in to weed it. So I just think it's not necessary. Just let the mulch come down to the sidewalk. And you can dig a trench along the sidewalk and the bed, dig a trench through there, remove the soil. So then when you add the mulch, it falls down into that trunk and into that trench and doesn't keep, washing out onto your sidewalk. If you use stone edging, if you're going to use this with Bermuda or zoysia, be sure that you concrete or mortar those stones together, because Bermuda and zoysia will find every single crack between those stones and will invade your bed. If you're using that kind of a border with St. Augustine, it's not a huge issue because St. Augustine does not grow underground. It only grows above ground with stolons. So what's wrong with this picture? Let's review. One, the edging is just sitting on top of the ground. It was not installed in. And they've got a mallet, a sledgehammer right there that they're just going to beat it into the ground. And you can't do that. You have to dig a trench. You can't just beat the edging in or you will damage it. And then you can see that they did not remove the grass or kill the grass before they added the compost. So this is just a mess waiting to happen. Now, I know this is very controversial, but when I'm doing beds for clients and we have to get them in quickly, we do kill the grass ahead of time, because even just digging Bermuda, if it leaves behind any roots, it will just come back. You can dig with St. Augustine because, again, it only grows above ground stolons, but I do not recommend Roundup 365. That is for if you want a parking lot where you want scorched earth and nothing to grow. The Roundup in the purple bottle is a glyphosate only, so it does not stay in the soil. It has to touch green growing foliage to do its job. But please be careful, read the label, wear appropriate clothing to handle it, and just be careful. And you don't have to use this. It's just a suggestion. with Bermuda, because Bermuda can be so tenacious. And if you will kill it once and be done with it, it's not something that you have to keep applying. It's just a one-time thing. So moving off of that, my other little thing is downspout extensions. In that lower left picture, I'm baffled by that picture because they put in the cobble as a creek bed to handle the water, but then they put in that long extension beside it. I would have run the cobble right up to the downspout and let the water run over the cobblestone. In the top picture, what I would do is I would add a different elbow at the bottom and make the water go toward the driveway. And then I would take the edging and make it go over to the driveway as well. And then I would add cobblestone in that area. So when the water comes down the downspout, it will hit the cobblestone and go out onto the driveway. And you don't have a mowing hassle then. So this is what I like to do, called downspout creek beds. I will install a creek bed below a downspout. So when the water comes out, it will run down the cobble and then out the bed. Ideally, though, you would want some PVC pipe put in, if I can show you this, right here at that mortar joint. If you'll add a PVC pipe down there, a hole, so it allows any residual water to get out that area. And then add some boulders along the side, and it just makes it look a little more naturalized. Here you can see in this particular bed, the downspouts coming down at the corner right there, and then it runs onto the cobble and out. So just real quickly through some before and after pictures to kind of incorporate all the things that we've talked about here. This is showing a before at a landscape in Colleyville, and we wanted to add a perennial bed down the front. So you can see where the edging's in, and we are in the process of killing that grass. And then we added a perennial bed up the sidewalk, and then you can just see how that looks in the fall. It's just a really pretty, colorful walk up to the front door now. In my front landscape, I just needed more flowers. So here you can see how I've laid out that orange electrical cord I was talking about, and then the interior bed, you can see how the hose has been laid out. So that's the before, just laying out the bed. And this is how it looks afterward in the fall. This is how that area looks in the summertime with different perennials blooming. And in the next program, we're going to be talking about all of these perennials. So this is the front of my landscape along the street in that area called the Parkway or the Hell Strip. So instead of having to mow that every week, I converted it to a perennial bed. And this is some of the plant material there. Again, we'll go through all of these things next week. This is just showing it in the springtime. So I have bulbs in here that come up in February and March, and then they fade back, and then the spring perennials come up, and then the summer perennials and the fall perennials. So it's just a constant succession of blooms in this area. This is at a client in Keller. She had a similar situation along her driveway where it was just a skinny little thing of grass right there. So we did the same thing. We planted it up with low-growing perennials that could handle that full blasting sun and that reflective heat against the driveway. And then this was a client in South Lake who, they used to be able to walk across their patio, but then they added an outdoor kitchen. So now they blocked that walkway and they needed a walkway through the bed. And then you can see against the house, the Burford hollies there are, they're blocking the window. So we removed those, and then we added this walkway with flagstone and dwarf mondo around the flagstone, and then we replaced the hollies with a holly fern because they can handle the shade of this north side of the house, and they'll never grow taller than they are right there. So they'll just kind of grace the bottom of the window without covering half of the window. And we added a Japanese maple in the corner. That one is a tall, it grows taller than it does wide, so it's a very columnar growth that would fit that space. So again, do your research on different Japanese maples if you want to use them, because there's lots of varieties for lots of different areas. This is at White's Chapel Methodist Church in South Lake, and this is actually an old pool decking. And they wanted a sanctuary garden there. There's an old homestead on the property, and they have support group meetings there. And so they wanted a lovely garden out the back side of that area. So when they were done with the meetings, people could go out and enjoy a garden. So we created this. And it's a bed with shrubs and perennials, and there's a fountain, a 3-urn fountain right there, and some benches around that area. And then there's an herb garden right there. The plant in the foreground is Jerusalem sage, which is excellent perennial for our area. I'll talk about that next week. This is at a client in Keller, and she just had this boring, expansive yard looking across at her neighbor's trees. And we created this beautiful ecosystem of a pond. So now her patio is right off to the right-hand side of that. And so now she can sit on her patio and enjoy all the wildlife that comes. This is at my church garden in South Lake. And we had this little courtyard area that was just crummy looking grass. And we converted it to a colorful courtyard of perennials and the fountain. I showed you the fountain picture in the beginning to illustrate the focal point, and this is that garden. And so we just use a lot of perennials there. The roses that you see in the middle of that picture are no longer there. I replaced them with Canyon Creek Abelia because the roses succumb to rosette disease. This is just another picture of that. You can see how behind the benches there, those are the Canyon Creek Abelias in those areas. And then this is another area at my church garden. It's a really steep slope that was very difficult to mow. So what we did is we removed the grass and then we added boulders and tiered that area with boulders just strategically placed down the slope to hold the soil. And then I planted it with full sun loving perennials. This is southwest exposure. So I knew all of those plants had to be able to handle blasting sun. So this is right after the perennials were planted. This was the first spring, the first summer, and then the first fall. So you can see how those perennials have done so well. This garden is only 2 years old and it's performing really well. And I need inspiration too. This was taken at the Philbrook Museum up in Tulsa. And when I saw this picture, I saw that it was some steps going down a steep slope and they had used boulders and perennials. So I thought, I can use that idea at my church garden. So even if some of the things that I'm showing you now, you're not going to do the exact same thing, I hope that they give you kind of a jumping off or an inspiration point. This particular spot here, it was this path that went to nowhere and tiny little out of scale flagstone that just kind of go to the edge of the lawn, but that is a spa, a hot tub in the background there. So how do you get to there without either going through the bed and tracking mulch into the spa or walking through the lawn and tracking grass clippings into the lawn? So what we did is we used appropriately sized flagstone that lead through the bed to the spa. So now you can walk on rock to get there. And then I also incorporated the trees within the bed for easier mowing. And then we added shade plantings on the left and some shrubs on the right-hand side that can handle a little more sun. So this particular front walk is so crowded and overgrown. They've got variegated privet and Burford holly and Yopon holly all in a 4-foot wide bed up to the front door. And then they have junipers and loropetalums, and just everything is so overgrown. So what we did is we removed everything except for the crepe myrtle. I don't particularly like the crepe myrtle being right in front of the front door, but it had never had crepe myrtle, committed on it, and it was so pretty shaped that it decided to leave it. And what we did then was plant smaller shrubs that will grow to fit that 4-foot space. We used kaleidoscope abelias. And then we created the downspout creek beds to carry the water out onto the lawn. And then added some perennials. So this here is at a garden in Colleyville, and they have a very steep slope in their backyard and lots of mature trees and mature to the point where they couldn't grow turf anymore. And you can see the erosion that is happening here. So what we did is I call myself the queen of creek beds because I use a lot of creek beds. You cannot get an underground drain through this area because you can't dig through all those roots. So we use surface drainage with this rock. So then we added some boulders along the edge and created some beds for the water to flow through. Just a little maturing of that area there, so you can see how the water gets carried through the creek bed, but yet we have shade plantings on each side of it. And again, I'll go through all this plant material next week. Same client at the other side of her yard, same situation, can't grow turf. But they needed a walkway to get through that area. So we added some flagstone and the little dwarf mondo. And they also have water that runs through that area through the trees. So we needed a creek bed to carry that water on down. And it all runs to the front of the house. This particular client just reshaped the front yard for a little bit easier mowing. And you can see the end result with that. It just created this big sweep of lawn. There is a creek bed that goes right here that carries water all the way back to the back of the house down to core property at Lake Grapevine. This particular client needed some screening from the street when they're sitting on their patio. They just wanted something to kind of screen. And they also have drainage that runs right through this area. So we added some large hollies to do some screening, and then we added the creek bed to carry the water, and then just added some shrubs around that, showing that a little more matured. This particular client, they knew that a 2-story house was going to be going in right next door. That's a 1-story beyond, but a 2-story was going to be built. So they wanted to plan some plantings that would help to screen that house. So what we did is we planted some crepe myrtles that we knew would grow 30 feet tall. So right now they don't look like that, but you can see as they've matured, it's accomplished what we wanted. They now that house next door, the 2-story windows can't see into this backyard because those trees. The crepe myrtles are accomplishing the screening. So this is just a shady, relaxing spot in a South Lake garden where she just added some flagstone and a hammock there to meander through her shady garden. And again, we'll go through all these plant materials next week. This particular garden here, that's sod in the lower area below the retaining wall, they were constantly having to replace that. I mean, every year they would have to replace it. So I suggested, why not turn it into a walkway area and remove the sod? So that's what we did. We added, again, the flagstone, and that walks around to her garage where, she can just walk back and forth to tend to her garden and get the supplies out of her garage. And then we added a little seating area there so she can visit with neighbors when they walk by. So just see that transformation there. This particular garden was surrounded by photinias back in the day, and all of those were ripped out. We started with a clean slate. I will say that you can see this big creek bed that runs through the 2 yards. These neighbors had to go in on this together because all of their downspouts are now tied into that creek bed. So that the water comes down the downspouts and runs into that large creek bed and then gets carried out to the street. But they kind of shared that problem of drainage through the 2 yards. So they did share the cost of that. This particular garden here just had, some steps going down the slopes, not very attractive. You can see that brown circle over there on the right-hand side. That was a mulberry tree. And going back to scale, that was a huge, huge tree that was just absolutely dwarfing this 1-story house. And it's not the best of trees. So we ended up having that removed. And they wanted a little more exciting walkway up to the front steps. So we added this bed, and you can see it's on a slope. So we added boulders to kind of tier the area up the steps. So when the water would come down, it would have to go down those tiers instead of just screaming down. And then you can just see a progression of that, of the perennials there. So when they're sitting up on their front porch, they can look down on this area and see those perennials. And they have a little fountain up there, so it just makes for a very much more enjoyable place to sit. So this is what I was talking about before. This is another right plant, wrong place. This is a Nellie R. Stevens holly. I'm sorry for the blurriness of that picture. I think it was a Google Earth picture. But this is trying to keep a 15-foot shrub about 2 feet tall, 3 feet tall. It is asking too much of that shrub, and it just butchers that shrub. So there's a much better solution, and that is removing those shrubs and creating a bed that has much more appropriately sized plants on it. So not all landscapes have to be big, huge projects. They can just be this small little front bed. And this just shows it, shows some cobblestone there. She has since added gutters, but I knew she didn't have gutters when this garden was created. And so I knew that the water would be coming down the roof and hitting that sidewalk and then running, and I didn't want it to wash out her bed. So we added cobblestone along the edge to help prevent erosion. And this just shows it this spring after 1 year of, 1 season of maturing. So this garden here, it's showing the front yard is just slip sliding away. There are 2 large live oaks in her front yard, creating very dense shade. that won't grow turf grass. And so that's a slope, and it's just running down onto the sidewalk, actually creating a hazard there for anybody walking by on that slippery mud. So we ended up adding some large boulders and kind of tiering that area, and then adding big blue liriope, which is a ground cover liriope. But the liriope can handle a little more sun. Mondo grass needs a little more shade. So this is on the south side of her house. So that's another thing, considering those sun angles, is that going to get late day or, late season sun when the sun goes back in that southern angle? So just think about those things. So we added the liriope, and it works like a charm. And this is, we're getting close here, but this is another shady erosion situation where they have sandy soil and a slope, and couldn't grow turf grass. So all that sand, every time it rained, was just rushing down the hill. So again, we tiered the area with some boulders, and then used some chopped stone to create some ground cover areas, and heavily planted with ground covers and shade tolerant plants to slow the water coming down that hill. So now it has to slowly, go down the tiers, but it's also going through some plant material that can handle that shade. Just another view of that area. That's regular Mondo in the foreground there. That will completely, this is right after it was planted, so it will completely fill in there. And then one of the last pictures here, last year, some clients of mine wanted to take this grassy side yard and turn it into a vegetable garden. So that's what we did. And it's a sloped area, so we knew we were going to have to tier the area with some retaining walls. So we started digging out and adding some retaining walls. And now she has this beautiful, productive vegetable garden instead of, just that grassy area right there. Now, if you have some pets and you need a grassy area, that's fine. But she and her husband are retired and they wanted to vegetable garden, so they've created this. So now I'm just about done. I just want to show you some of my top gardening references that have been helpful for me. Of course, Neil Sperry's latest book, and then Easy Gardens for North Central Texas is Steve Huddleston's book. He's from the Fort Worth Botanic Garden. And then, of course, the Native Plants book. And Greg Grant, who's an East Texas plant guy, he wrote this home landscaping book, and it's been very helpful for me as well. So some helpful websites. One thing I want to encourage you to do when you're Googling anything, if you have a disease, an insect problem, a plant question, anything, when you Google it, put tamu.edu either before or after what you're Googling, and you will get Texas A&M University researched information. So you know that you're getting reliable information. And then, of course, Texas Smartscape, Texas Superstar has a great plant database. Both of those do. The Native Plant Society of Texas, and then Tarrant County Master Gardeners have a great website. In fact, I think this video will be recorded and placed on their YouTube channel. And then SaveTarrantWater.com. They've got lots of great and helpful videos on their website as well. So check those out. And then also, I have a blog. In fact, I just posted my summer newsletter today. So if you want to check that out, all this is just free information. And then I have a Facebook page and Instagram that I will post information and sometimes just pretty pictures for inspiration. So anyway, we do all this landscaping design and prep and everything. And sometimes, a plant just needs a crack in the concrete to grow. So that's nature's way of doing it. And so I hope that you are encouraged and inspired, and I hope this gave you some jumping off ideas that you can do in your landscape. And that's all I have.